Okidbo was a village where tradition was law, where the will of the gods could not be questioned, and where daughters were not raised for themselves but for the men who would claim them. It was a place where stories of powerful women were whispered like myths, warnings passed down from mother to daughter, teaching them that a woman who defied her destiny was a woman doomed to suffer. That Adora had always dreamed of being one of those women. From the time she was a child, she had questioned everything. Why did the elders say the gods only spoke through men? Why were girls married off while boys trained to become warriors, healers, or scholars? Why did her mother, Mama Neka, insist that her beauty was the greatest thing she possessed when Adora longed to be valued for something more? Your beauty is your wealth, Mama Neka always told her as she rubbed scented oils into her skin. And wealth must be used wisely. To her mother, Adora was an investment. She had always known that her mother had big plans for her, but she had never imagined it would lead to this. It was the day of the new moon when the Oba's messengers arrived. The market was alive with noise and color. Women called out to customers, selling groundnuts, yam, and fresh palm oil. The village blacksmith hammered metal in the distance, while children ran between stalls, their laughter filling the air. Adora had been at Elder Chijiok's hut, borrowing a book, an old, tattered thing that smelled of dust and history. She had just stepped out when she noticed the silence. A hush had fallen over the village. The market women who had been shouting only moments ago now stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the entrance of the square. The blacksmith's hammer was still. Even the children had stopped running. Then she saw them. 3 men dressed in royal blue agbadas entered the village, their presence commanding and severe. They walked with a slow, deliberate grace, each step filled with unshakable authority. Their leader, an older man with a grey beard and piercing eyes, stepped forward. Baba Ojonla, the Oba's chief messenger. In his hands was a scroll. Adeora's heart began to race. She had heard the stories before, stories of girls chosen to be the Oba's wives, of families who rejoiced at the honor, of mothers who wept with happiness knowing their daughters would live in luxury. But she had also heard the whispers. The Oba's wives disappeared. Some said they died in childbirth. Others claimed they were sent away, hidden from the world. But the most terrifying rumor of all was that they were taken by something even worse than death. Baba Ojonla unrolled the scroll and cleared his throat. His voice rang out through the silent village. By the decree of His Royal Majesty, Oba Adatakunbo, Adora, daughter of Neka, has been chosen to be the 8th wife of the palace. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Adora felt her blood turn to ice. No. This wasn't happening. She turned to Mama Neka, hoping, praying that her mother would protest. That she would stand up and say, "No. My daughter is too young. My daughter deserves a choice." But her mother was smiling. A slow, triumphant smile. "The gods have smiled upon us," Mama Neka said, her voice thick with pride. Adora took a step back. "Mama." Her mother turned to her, her eyes sharp with warning. "You will not refuse the Oba." Adeora's hands clenched into fists. She could feel the weight of every eye in the village on her, waiting to see how she would react. Waiting to see if she would dare to defy fate. She shook her head. "I won't do this." A murmur ran through the crowd. Baba Ojonla's gaze settled on her, cold and final. The Oba does not take refusal kindly. Adora knew what that meant. Everyone did. The last girl who had refused the Oba's proposal had vanished overnight. No one had spoken of her again. The village elder, an old woman named Mama Uche, stepped forward. Her voice was gentle, but firm. "Adora, my child," she said. "The Oba's word is law. You will be a queen." Adora met the old woman's eyes. There was pity there. Pity, but no hope. Because there was no hope. The decision had already been made. The bride price had already been paid. She had never been her own person. She had always been her mother's prize. That night, the house was filled with celebration. Mama Neka had invited half the village to feast. The air smelled of grilled meat and palm wine, and the drums played late into the night. But Adeora couldn't eat. She sat in the corner of the hut, staring at the wall. Jide found her there. Jide, her best friend. The boy she had grown up with, the boy who had always believed in her dreams of leaving the village. He knelt beside her, his face shadowed with worry. "I'll take you away," he whispered. Adeora's chest tightened. "They'll kill you." "I don't care." His eyes burned with determination. "I won't let them take you." For a moment, she let herself believe it was possible. That she could run away, disappear into the forest, escape this fate. But then her mother's voice rang through the hut. "Adeora." Jide quickly stood up as Mama Necker approached. Her mother's gaze was cold. "Go to bed," Mama Necker ordered. "You will enter the palace tomorrow." Adeora wanted to scream. She wanted to fight. But she knew. If she fought now, she would never leave this village alive. So she swallowed her rage, nodded, and rose to her feet. But as she walked to her sleeping mat, she stole one last glance at Jide. And in that moment, she made a vow. She would survive. No matter what it took. Even if it meant destroying the palace from the inside. The morning of the wedding, Okigbo was alive with music, dancing, and celebration. The drummers pounded their talking drums, sending deep, rhythmic vibrations through the air. Women in brightly colored wrappers swayed their hips, ululating in joy. The scent of roasted goat meat, fried plantains, and fresh palm wine filled the air. But Adeora felt none of it. She sat in the inner chamber of her mother's hut, dressed in a red and gold iro and buba embroidered with intricate beadwork. Her wrists and ankles jingled with gold bangles, and her hair had been styled into elaborate braids, adorned with coral beads. A thick layer of scented oil had been rubbed into her skin, and white uli patterns had been painted onto her arms. She should have felt like a queen. But all she felt was trapped. "You look beautiful, my daughter," Mama Necker said, adjusting one of the beads in Adeora's hair. "The Oba will be pleased." Adeora didn't respond. Pleased? That was all that mattered to her mother, that she pleased the Oba. That she made a good wife. That she secured the family's future. Not that she was being sold. Not that she was being given away like a prize goat at the market. Outside, the villagers chanted her name. Adeora, the chosen bride. Adeora, the queen of Okigbo. Their voices rang with admiration, but she knew the truth. She was not chosen. She was taken. The palace was unlike anything Adeora had ever seen. It was massive, built with ancient stones that had weathered time itself. Giant bronze statues of past kings lined the entrance, their eyes hollow and watchful. The gates were carved with the symbols of the gods, glowing faintly in the golden sunlight. The moment she entered, Adeora felt uneasy. There was something wrong with this place. It was too quiet. Despite the laughter and music from the guests, the air itself felt heavy. Thick, like unseen hands pressing against her skin. A shiver ran down her spine. Then she saw him. The Oba. He stood at the center of the palace courtyard, dressed in black robes embroidered with gold. His head was adorned with a crown of iron and beads, and his fingers were covered in rings, thick, gleaming bands of gold and ivory. But it was his eyes that terrified her. They were dark. Too dark. They seemed to swallow light, pulling everything into their depths. "You are more beautiful than I imagined," the Oba said as she approached. His voice was deep, smooth, but it held no warmth. Adeora clenched her fists. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But she couldn't. The entire village was watching. Mama Necker stood beside her, beaming with pride. The high priest stepped forward, raising his hands to silence the crowd. The wedding ceremony had begun. Adeora barely heard the incantations, barely felt the cold iron bangle being fastened onto her wrist, the symbol that marked her as the Oba's wife. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as the priest's voice rang out. "Do you, Adeora, take Oba Adetokunbo as your husband, to honor and obey, to serve and please?" She hesitated. Her gaze flickered toward the crowd. Jide stood at the back. His fists were clenched, his expression unreadable. Adeora felt something tighten in her chest. He was the only one who saw her fear. The only one who understood that this was wrong. The priest's voice came again. Do you, Adeora, take the oba? Mama Neka's nails dug into her arm. Adeora's throat was dry. This was it. Her last chance to say no. Her last chance to fight. But she wasn't ready to die. So she swallowed her fear. And whispered, I do. The crowd erupted in cheers. The oba's smirk widened. And then he kissed her. His lips were cold. And in that moment, Adeora knew. She had made a terrible mistake. The sun had set by the time Adeora was led to the oba's chambers. The room was lavish, golden tapestries, a bed large enough to fit 5 people, and dimly lit lanterns that flickered against the stone walls. The air smelled of burning incense, thick and suffocating. The oba sat on the bed, watching her. Come, he said, his voice deep and commanding. Adeora took a step back. Can we take things slow? She asked carefully. The oba laughed. Your mother trained you better than this, he said. Adeora's blood ran cold. He knew. He knew that Mama Neka had taught her how to be the perfect bride. How to serve. How to obey. How to submit. But Adeora was not like the others. She had no intention of submitting. Suddenly, a knock at the door. My king, an urgent call, a guard's voice called from outside. The oba sighed. Wait for me here. The moment he was gone, Adeora grabbed a piece of parchment and scribbled a message. She stuffed it into her sleeve and hurried to the window. Below, the palace grounds were vast, patrolled by armed guards. Escape would be impossible alone. She needed help. She needed Jide. Her hands trembled as she turned away from the window. Then, the door creaked open. Adeora froze. Standing there was a woman. Her face was beautiful but pale, her eyes haunted. She wore an old wedding dress, the fabric torn and faded. You must leave, the woman whispered. Adeora's stomach twisted. Who was she? Before she could speak, the woman turned and vanished into the shadows. Adeora's breath hitched. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And she had just become part of it. The corridors of the palace were quiet at night, too quiet. No sound of servants moving. No hushed conversations. Just an eerie silence. Adeora lay on the grand bed, staring at the ceiling. The oba had not returned, and she was grateful for it. But the words of the mystery woman from earlier haunted her. You must leave. Who was she? And why had she disappeared like that? Adeora sat up, her heart pounding. Something about this place was wrong. Her mind went to the West Wing, the part of the palace that was off limits. You must never enter the West Wing, Ayamoniki, the first wife, had warned. That part of the palace is forbidden. But why? Adeora clenched her fists. She would find out. Slipping out of bed, Adeora grabbed a small oil lamp and stepped into the hallway. The marble floors were cool beneath her feet as she moved quickly, keeping close to the walls. The air felt different here. Thicker. Heavier. She reached the large wooden doors of the West Wing. They were covered in ancient carvings, symbols she did not recognize. Her hands trembled as she pushed them open. A rush of cold air met her. She stepped inside. The room was massive, lined with old portraits of women. Adeora frowned. The women all wore wedding attire, just like her. But their eyes were hollow. Their expressions were filled with fear. Then, she noticed something else. At the far end of the hall was a row of glass cases. Inside each case was a wedding veil, each one covered in dried blood. Adeora's breath hitched. Her hands began to tremble. These were the oba's wives. The ones who had vanished. You shouldn't be here. Adeora spun around. Standing in the doorway was Elogia, the second wife. Her expression was grim. Adeora's voice was barely a whisper. What happened to them? Elogia looked at the glass cases. Her face was haunted. The Oba does not allow his wives to leave, she murmured. Adeora's chest tightened. But why? What happened to them? Elogia stepped closer. They displeased him. Adeora's throat felt dry. And when a wife displeases the Oba? Elogia's eyes darkened. She disappears. A chill ran through Adeora's veins. Her stomach twisted. This was not a palace. It was a graveyard. And she was next. The oil lamp flickered. The air grew cold. Then, a shadow moved. A figure stepped out from the darkness. Adeora's blood froze. It was the woman from earlier. But now, Adeora could see her clearly. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken. She looked like a ghost. Adeora stumbled backward. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, suddenly, a whisper filled the air. Run! The oil lamp went out. Darkness swallowed the room. And then came the screams. Not just one scream, but many. Wailing. Crying. The sounds of women in agony. Adeora's heart raced. She turned and ran. She did not stop running until she reached her chambers. Her breath came in short gasps as she slammed the door shut. Her mind was spinning. She had seen them. The missing wives. They were still here. And they were trapped. She had to get out of this palace. Before she became one of them. Adeora lay awake in her chambers, her heart pounding against her ribs. The visions of the West Wing haunted her, the blood-stained veils, the whispers of the vanished wives, the way the shadows moved unnaturally. She had seen enough. She had to leave. But escaping the palace would not be easy. The walls were high, the guards were many, and the Oba was watching. And worse. Something unnatural lived within this palace. Something not human. She needed help. Jide. The thought of him filled her with both hope and fear. Jide had promised to save her. But could he? Could anyone? She tore a strip of fabric from her sleeve and quickly scribbled a message using a piece of charcoal from the fire pit. I have seen the truth. The palace is cursed. I must leave. Help me. I will wait by the palace walls at the midnight drum. She folded the message and called a servant girl, one of the younger maids she had befriended. Take this, she whispered. Find Jide. Give it to him. The girl's eyes widened. My lady, if I'm caught, I will protect you, Adeora promised. Please? I have no one else. The girl hesitated. Then she nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Adeora closed her eyes, her hands trembling. Now, all she could do was wait. By nightfall, the palace was silent. The evening feast had ended. The servants had gone to their quarters. The lanterns flickered dimly in the corridors. Adeora moved carefully, her feet bare on the marble floors as she made her way toward the courtyard. Then, a voice. You should not be out so late, my wife. Adeora froze. The Oba stood in the corridor, watching her. His dark robes flowed like shadows, and his eyes, those terrible, soulless eyes, seemed to pierce into her mind. She swallowed her fear and lowered her head. I could not sleep, she lied. The Oba's smirk was slow. Knowing. He stepped closer, lifting a hand to caress her cheek. Adeora flinched. You are afraid, he murmured. His fingers were ice-cold against her skin. You have seen the West Wing, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Adeora's breath hitched. He knew. The Oba leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. There is no escape from me, Adeora. A chill ran down her spine. The Oba pulled away, smiling. Go back to bed, my dear. You will need your strength. With that, he turned and vanished into the darkness. Adeora's hands trembled as she slipped into the shadows of the palace, her heart hammering in her chest. The midnight drum sounded from the village, its deep, rhythmic beats marking the time. Jide would be waiting. She moved quickly toward the palace walls, every step careful, every breath measured. Then, a whisper. She turned sharply, her pulse spiking. No one was there. But the air was thick, charged with an unseen presence. She took another step. And then, a hand grabbed her wrist. She gasped, twisting in fear. But it was Jide. He was dressed in dark robes, his eyes fierce. You came, she breathed. I told you I would, he said. Jide pulled a rope from beneath his tunic and began tying it to a post near the wall. Adeora's heart pounded. They were so close. Then, a scream split the air. Adeora's stomach twisted. Run! Jide shouted. Guards stormed the courtyard, their torches flaring in the dark. Adeora grabbed Jide's hand, racing toward the wall. But before they could climb, a shadow moved. And the Oba appeared. His presence was unnatural, his robes flowing like black smoke. Adeora froze in terror. The Oba lifted a hand. And suddenly, the air around them shifted. It felt like invisible hands were closing around her throat. Jide lunged at the Oba, swinging his blade. But the Oba did not move. Instead, Jide's sword shattered into dust. The guards closed in. Adeora struggled to breathe. The Oba was not just a man. He was something else. Something ancient. Something monstrous. Darkness swirled around them, and Adeora realized. This was no ordinary escape. This was a battle for her soul. The air crackled with an unnatural force. Adeora's lungs burned as she gasped for breath, struggling against the invisible pressure closing around her throat. Jide was on his knees, his face twisted in pain. His sword had turned to dust, as if it had never existed. The Oba stood before them, his dark robes flowing like living shadows. His eyes glowed, no longer just black, but something deeper, something endless. You dare to betray me, Adeora? His voice was calm, almost amused. Adeora clawed at the unseen force choking her. You are not human, she managed to rasp. The Oba smiled. No, my dear, he said softly. I am not. And then, he changed. His figure shifted, growing taller, his robes melting into darkness. His skin cracked like old earth, revealing something beneath, something ancient and monstrous. His hands were no longer hands. They were clawed shadows, stretching toward her. Adeora's blood ran cold. She had known the palace was cursed. She had seen the horrors of the West Wing. But she had never imagined this. The Oba was not just a king. He was a demon. A scream tore through the air. Adeora turned just in time to see Eloja running toward them, a black calabash clutched in her hands. The second wife, who had once warned her, who had lived in fear, had finally made her choice. She threw the calabash to the ground, and it shattered. A deep boom echoed through the palace. The ground shook. And suddenly, the air was filled with voices. Wailing. Screaming. The voices of the dead wives. Shadows poured from the west wing, swirling like a raging storm. The Oba staggered, his form flickering, his power weakening. You have held us for too long, a ghostly voice cried. Adeora recognized the woman. The spirit from the wedding chamber. The missing wives were not gone. They had been trapped. And now, they were free. The palace collapsed around them. Walls cracked, the floor trembled. The Oba screamed as the shadows latched onto him, clawing at his body. His form withered, shifting between man and monster. No, he roared, his voice shaking the heavens. Adeora forced herself to stand. She had one chance. One final moment to end this nightmare. She grabbed the dagger at her waist, the one she had smuggled from the feast. The ogre's burning gaze locked onto hers. "You cannot kill me," he sneered. Adeora gritted her teeth. "Watch me." She plunged the dagger into his chest. The ogre's roar shattered the sky. His body convulsed, his skin cracking, shadows pouring from his wounds. The spirits of his dead wives rose higher, surrounding him in a swirling mass of darkness. And then, silence. The ogre's form collapsed into dust. The air shifted. The curse was broken. And for the first time since she had entered the palace, Adeora was free. Jide grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the gates. Eloja, the only remaining wife, nodded at her. "Go," she said. "But what about you?" Adeora asked. Eloja smiled sadly. "This is my home," she whispered. And then she vanished into the crumbling palace. Adeora didn't look back. She and Jide ran. Through the shattered hallways. Through the broken gates. Through the darkness. Until, at last, they were outside. The first rays of sunlight touched her skin. And she knew. It was over. The first rays of sunlight kissed Adeora's skin as she stepped beyond the gates of the palace. She had never noticed before how bright the morning light was. She had never felt the air so fresh, so free. For days, she had been trapped within the cursed palace, surrounded by the whispers of the dead. But now, the ogre was gone. The curse had been broken. But the scars remained. Jide held her hand tightly as they made their way through the forest, following the narrow paths that led back to Okigbo. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There was too much to say. Too much that could never be unseen. At last, Jide broke the silence. "You did it," he said softly. Adeora didn't respond. Because the truth was, she wasn't sure what she had done. Had she won? Or had she simply survived? She had killed the ogre, but in doing so, she had uncovered a darkness older than the palace itself. Would it ever truly be over? She shook the thoughts away. One step at a time. She was alive. That was all that mattered now. By the time they reached Okigbo, the news had already spread. People gathered in the marketplace, murmuring in low voices as Adeora and Jide approached. Mothers held their daughters close. The elders whispered amongst themselves. Adeora could see the fear in their eyes. Not of the ogre. Not of the curse. But of her. She had left as a bride, a girl promised to the most powerful man in the land. Now, she had returned alone, with the palace in ruins and no king to rule it. To them, she was a mystery. A threat. Mama Neka stood at the front of the crowd, her eyes sharp and unreadable. "You destroyed everything," she hissed. Adeora stiffened. Even now, her mother did not care about the truth. She did not ask if Adeora was hurt. She did not ask what horrors Adeora had faced. All she saw was that the future she had planned was gone. "You were supposed to be queen," Mama Neka continued, her voice low. Adeora met her mother's gaze. "No, Mama," she said firmly. "I was supposed to be free." A murmur spread through the crowd. Mama Neka's lips pressed into a thin line. And for the first time, Adeora realized. She would never earn her mother's approval. And she no longer needed it. The village feared her, but they also respected her. The young girls looked at her with awe, whispering her name like a legend. The elders did not know what to do with her. A woman who had defied tradition. A woman who had killed a king. She was no longer a bride. She was no longer a prisoner. She was something else entirely. And she would never let anyone own her again. Days passed. The village returned to its normal rhythm, but Adeora knew she could never be the same. She had faced death. She had faced a demon. And she had survived. But there was one more thing she had to do. She made her way to the small hut at the edge of the village. Inside, behind iron bars, sat Mama Necker. Her own greed had led to her downfall. When the elders heard of the deal she had made, of how she had sold her own daughter, they had turned against her. Now, she was a prisoner. Not in a palace, but in a cage of her own making. Adeora stepped forward. Mama Necker lifted her head, her eyes dull with anger. "You think you've won," she hissed. Adeora shook her head. "There was never a game to win, Mama," she said softly. "Only a life to take back." Mama Necker's expression twisted. "You won't survive without me," she whispered. Adeora smiled. "I already am." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. She did not look back. She never would. That night, Adeora sat beneath the mango tree, the very same one where she had once dreamed of a life beyond Okigbo. Jide sat beside her. He smiled. "Are you ready for your real life to begin?" Adeora breathed in deeply, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. For the first time, she was not afraid. For the first time, she was free. She turned to Jide, a small smile on her lips. "Yes?" And as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the voices of the past, she knew. This was only the beginning. Dear viewers, not all that glitters is gold. Some paths are paved with riches, but they lead to cages. Some traditions are honored, but they are built on chains. True freedom is not something given, it is something taken. Never let anyone decide your destiny for you. Be strong. Be wise. And most importantly, never be afraid to walk away from a life that does not belong to you. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. See you all in my next video. Bye.